So the first bit, again, was this is like the theory of this kind of design work, if you like. The second bit is creating a school which can start producing what we think, maybe those kinds of skills and perspectives. And the third one is more then, can we do that in collaboration, in practice with places, so that we also have a meaningful impact on and with the world, as opposed to just doing it in the academy.
Are you interested in the city as a tangle of systems and flows? What do you think is the connection among nature, technology, and culture? How can we create real smart cities? Stay tuned for answers from Dan Hill.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Dan Hill, the director of the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, hope and optimism, engineering and design, scale of cities, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Dan Hill is a designer, urbanist, and educator with extensive experience leading across multiple sectors. Dan is currently the director of Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne and the professor of the built environment. His career has spanned roles such as director of strategic design at Vinnova, Sweden's innovation agency, the Finnish innovation fund SITRA, and the global design firm Arup and the BBC. Dan has worked on urban development and design projects globally, collaborating with clients like Google, Lendlease, British Library, Victoria and Albert Museum, and City of Melbourne. He is also a founder board member of the Council of Urban Initiatives and UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and former professor at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. Dan is an accomplished author, known for works like Dark Matter and Trojan Horses and Designing Missions. And with that, Dan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. Let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Future of cities. There's the future of cities themselves as a kind of form of settlement. And then there's the future of all of the cities that we live within. Maybe there's a couple of things there. So one of them is that we are, as I'm sure everybody that listens to this knows, we're a species that is now largely urbanized and will continue to do so for at least a while, as far as we can tell. So the future of our species looks quite urban to some degree, which means that cities themselves have a future in that sense. There's maybe a little note there we can come back to, is that I would say this as somebody whose job is cities, or is in theory an expert in cities, but I do worry slightly that we get a bit too obsessed with cities and that we forget that they're connected to regions and rural environments for food and biodiversity and the people and other forms of nature as well. So I want to put that on the table later, that there may be ways of thinking about cities which are a bit more systemic, which recognizes that cities are made up of things that are not cities too, just to complicate things a bit. Cities don't really have edges in that sense. And equally, we need to then find a future for those other places. So just to right away put a spanner in the works of your questions about cities, just to recognize that there are regions and environments that cities rely on that are intrinsically interdependent with, and that immediately blurs things a bit. So the second part of the question of the future of is one defined by complexity, ambiguity. There is no way that anybody here or anybody listening can predict what's going to happen with cities. It's impossible because it is more changeable than ever. And I guess that the challenges we're facing as well as a species, at least, ones that require genuine transformation, like quite radical forms of change. And so we have this engine of change driving through it into a world which is more and more diverse and complex and ambiguous. We're looking at all of that stuff about volatility and uncertainty. So the future is really unknown, which means then we need to get very good at handling ambiguity rather than trying to be certain about it. And that then changes, of course, the way we think about planning, urban planning in particular, city planning, all of those things. But it means we have to have a very different perspective on the idea of what the future of cities means. It's not something we can predict or engineer at all. It's quite the opposite.
We will get back to this engineering and planning thing because this is very interesting. But let's start with the city and its edges. What does the city mean to you?
The city is a tangle of systems and cultures, a knot, really, a set of knots of flows that come together at a certain place or point in time and place. And the reason I say that is, again, to stress these interdependencies between them, that there isn't, unlike the popular idea of maybe like a European medieval city with a wall around it, even that wasn't really true, obviously, because there were settlements outside the wall as well as inside, and there were materials from outside the wall as well as inside. So certainly that is now more blurred than ever. And it's very difficult to talk about the edge of a city in that sense. We can perhaps talk about it geographically a little bit, or at least physically a bit. There are points where it tapers out and becomes something that we can call exurban or like a countryside type state to some degree. But that, again, to me is then missing the point, because that countryside is the thing that is basically extracted in order to produce the city. The edge of the city, if you look at it in terms of flows of materials or knowledge or culture or ideas, all of those things mean that it's better to think of it as just a tangle or a knot in a set of flows and systems which are actually global or planetary in scale. The reason that's important, obviously, is it stresses the idea that there's no real meaningful difference between, say, Sydney or Melbourne or Singapore or London. They're all connected in interdependent flows. And particularly global north and global south, much as I don't like those terms, they're probably the most reasonable ones we have at the moment, at least. It recognizes really importantly that global north cities are built out of global south places and peoples and materials. Taking this kind of flow and system is super important, and it means that we can't pretend that there are these boundaries, even though we currently organize with those boundaries in mind through things like politics, for instance.
The city is the tangle and knot of systems and flows. And you mentioned that there is no real differentiation between Sydney and Melbourne or London or Singapore or New York.
To clarify, I should say, obviously, they do have distinct cultures and identities, those places. Those tangles and knots definitely have different characteristics. I'm just making the point, like Singapore, for instance, I was there a couple of weeks ago. It's a fascinating place, but all of its building materials are imported. Almost all of its food is, almost all of its energy is. Without materials and energy, food is both material and energy. What is Singapore? Singapore is the way that those things are put together in a particular pattern or place. Singaporean street food is then taking all those materials and then it's weaving it together and tangling it to produce Singaporean street food. But the materials that it's made from are from somewhere else, just as sometimes the cultures are as well. Same with the buildings of a particular form and identity, driven by particular, let's say, housing policies that are distinctly Singaporean. But literally all of those materials are from somewhere else. They're from other cities. And so I'm just making the point that you can have a distinct culture and identity in that tangling together, but that tangling together recognizes that those things are flowing backwards and forwards all the time, and they're interconnected. And that's the thing that we currently don't do very well. We don't really recognize that flow or those responsibilities at planetary scale. They're not different in a sense, of course they are, but they're also connected in another sense. That's what I'm getting at.
Thank you very much for the clarification, because it's fascinating that you say that from the same materials and energies, the cities create different characteristics based on the people live there, based on methods they are using. So I genuinely thank you for clarification, because then I would have asked, if there are no differences between them, then would the future of the cities be different for each city? The question still stands, because I don't want to give my answers to you. So would the future of these cities be different, even though they are connected?
Absolutely, because again, it goes back to that kind of cultural and political layer. The culture is the most important thing here. And it's often left out of, ironically enough, it's left out of, let's say, certain more sort of technocratic approaches to thinking about cities. but it's the culture of Singapore and London that make them different to each other. They're both large cities with millions of people in them, and they all have buildings, they all have food, and you have Singapore food in London and probably some aspect of London food in Singapore. But the differences between them are both geographical. Obviously, they have different climates, although those climates might interestingly get closer to each other than they have been in the past. As in, London will get warmer in the way that maybe Singapore used to be, and Singapore will get extra warm in the way that beyond London, just because of its latitude or its position in intercontinental flows and so on. So there will be differences there, of course, but they play out culturally. The culture is what determines the difference, really, as with anything. And that means that then it's a different approach to thinking of these cities as interchangeable. And this is always obviously a critique of things like smart city movements or engineering-led approaches or top-down urban planning. Why can't we just copy-paste this to there? Or maybe we can use the same air conditioning units in both places. Yes and no. Like each one of those is a question, really, and best approached culturally as opposed to pretending it's a very simple engineering place in that let's just say the technocratic approach, not that engineers do this, but let's say a technocratic approach might be both cities have 5 to 10 million people in them or 10 to 15 million people in them. People are basically the same everywhere. People should live in environments that are 22 degrees centigrade. Those are things you can try and engineer if you like, but that doesn't map onto the reality of those particular locations and their histories and cultures and path dependencies, and also the possibilities of local cultures, different approaches to these things, whether again it's how people choose to live together or what they want to do with their lives. Those things are highly distinct in either case. So on the one hand, those cities can look roughly similar if you view them from space, if you like. But then getting down to the street level, clearly they're completely different. They need this balance of super local kind of endogenous approaches, as in place approaches coming from these particular environments, and then a deep and interesting conversation about how are they connected and what could they learn from each other.
And while you are describing cities, you are only mentioning big ones, so Sydney, London, Singapore, Melbourne. Do you differentiate between city and town based on size or something like that? Based on the definition you mentioned for city as the knot of flows, as the conflux of systems, that doesn't really depend on size. Do you differentiate based on size?
No, I think the diversity of the flows is probably more important. And that tends to go with size to some degree, obviously. As in, a big city can have more possible connections and diversity in it than a very small village, by definition. I think then there are certain kind of thresholds and stepping points there, not, again, technical ones, but more sort of a question of when it starts to feel like a city or feel urban, which is an interesting kind of question. At what point does that happen? I think Jane Jacobs said a city is not just a big village. It's not just, let's take a village of 500 people and then stick a couple of noughts on the end of it, and then it's suddenly a city, right? There's something else that happens there, and that's really more to do with diversity than diversity and density to some extent, but I think the diversity is the key thing. But what makes a city is the possibility of encountering people that are not like you. And that's the difference there. It's really to do with this kind of cultural complexity again. I'm drawing a lot from people like Jacobs, but also Richard Sennett there. I think he more or less said, as paraphrasing, that the art of living in a city is living with people that are not like you and doing it well, essentially. That's what we need to strive for. And so the bigger the city is, just almost statistically, there's a greater chance of diversity. It doesn't necessarily follow, of course, because Beijing is a big city, but it's not as diverse as some smaller cities. It just depends, again, on culture and politics. In all of these cities, there's the possibility of living in this urban way. That doesn't happen more or less at smaller scale. Like a village is really defined by people that really are like you one way or another. And then a town to a certain point, I don't know, 40, 50,000. I think 40 or 50,000 is probably the average town size in Europe, average conurbation size. I think there's more towns at that scale than anything else in Europe, at least. So that's a fairly common kind of environment. But they tend to not have the diversity, obviously, of the medium to larger cities.
Based on your description that cities utilize the materials and energy different ways, Can this be translated as cities being consumers?
It depends on the politics again. So politics and culture, I keep bringing up, as you can tell, and they're entwined because politics is just how we make decisions about shared things, really. Culture is then a huge influence on that. But something like Singapore, for instance, imports all of those basic raw materials because it's grown to a certain point and had to make hard decisions about the amount of space it uses in a city-state island to devote to things like housing and industry and military and airports versus things like growing food and growing forests for buildings. It tends to make most of its buildings out of concrete and steel. Most of its forests disappeared a long time ago, not all of them, actually. A lot of them have been depleted because of space for urban expansion. But that wouldn't necessarily be the case. And so the interesting discussions there, at least, are can they grow 30% of their food by 2030? So they're now beginning to think, okay, we need to trade off some of these things and say we want a bit of food security, and let's shift them to producer as well as consumer. To your question, totally possible. It depends. Again, it depends on how we make those decisions. And you can do that also in lots of different ways. Obviously, you can grow food in the lab to some degree. You can grow food in vertical farms and things that we couldn't really do in the past. Rooftop farming to some degree, as well as more traditional things, as well as reclaiming land from the sea and using that for growing food as well. So all of those things are possible. And in the past, they didn't do that much of that in Singapore, and now they will. One could do the same with buildings. It would be just switching towards biomaterials, which they need to do anyway. In the past, I think we've been rather wasteful about the idea of materials and where they come from, as in the city just has been a consumer, if we think of it in those terms. But going back through history, this is a very colonial model, apologies, but the Roman city was a producer as well as a consumer, very careful about the way that it used excess waste and heat. And there was really no excess waste in old cities. So it's only really in the last 150 years or so that we've got particularly careless about that kind of thing. Before that, producers and consumers were together in cities. This again blurs the boundary. In the old days, let's say 100 years ago, you might say, yeah, we'll just throw our waste outside the city and not worry about it, and then we'll import some new stuff to build with or eat it. That isn't what we can do anymore. So this kind of circular idea where a producer is a consumer, as a producer is a consumer, and it's a circle rather than a system with waste in it, that's coming back pretty strongly in cities. It's going to have to anyway. It's not there at the moment. That's absolutely going to need to be a lot more nuanced than we have been in the past.
And I would like to come back to the first few sentences you said, that we are getting more and more urbanized, so the future of humanity will be urban.
I did place a caveat on it because I said, it can't be in the traditional sense of urban versus rural or urban versus regional. This idea that it's just megacities from now on, it can't work at all. I think that's what I'm getting at is that we still have those tangles and knots that produce cities, but we desperately need it to be connected to a wider system of flows, again, to produce materials and food and so on, biodiversity, all of those things, for forests, massive amount of reforestation to grow timber for buildings, for instance. All of those things need people not just working on them, but happy to do, thriving in those non-urban conditions too. And that's great, because then people have a choice. Do I want to live in the big city? Do I want to live in the big country? And move backwards and forwards between those two via some very nice kind of middle ground. That's probably what we need to think about. So that's what I was getting at, that we can't just valorize cities and just think, okay, it's the urban age, without realizing that actually cities rely massively on the rest of the world around them. And that also needs humans to be involved in cultivating those places, which means they need to be nice places to live, viable places to live, places that have meaningful economies and all of those things too. Beginning to see that. I'm doing some work in Japan in the recent months, which is looking at the rural depopulation to some degree because of a slowdown in birth rate and declining population in Japan, which is basically the same in almost all countries in the world now, very soon anyway, except for some of the African countries. And some of those African countries by the middle of the century will also be slowing down, almost all of them. So this is super interesting in this respect because Japan then is a leading edge kind of case study of this. And what you're beginning to see is still seeing a growth of overall in places like Kyoto and Osaka and Tokyo, even though the country itself is shrinking. So they're not really growing in real terms as such, but there is a shift from regions to city. But then at the same time, there's counter movement back, and it's not a strong one yet, and it's not a big one. But in places like Kagoshima, you're seeing towns that used to be, let's say, 40,000 people, might be a lot less than that now. So there's vacant buildings there. And the Nomura Research Institute estimate that might be as much as 30% of the households in Japan could be vacant within the next 9 years or so by 2033. So that's like an enormous shift. That means that those properties are worth nothing on the property market because there's not really demand in that sense of people rushing to fill them up. But at the same time, in existing towns with existing amenities, with train stations and schools and enough people there, just about, and super interesting because people are moving there and then doing interesting things with these basically free buildings. And so this big shift in that kind of urban economy, even if we talk about a town of 40,000 people being urban, it means that it's no longer based on this idea of real estate being a driver and real estate being a place where you sink the value. But instead, it's much more about what do you do with those buildings instead. Elementary schools being taken over and turned into community arts centres with music festivals attached, or forest schools and things like that. They're beginning to happen there because the buildings are worth nothing on the property market, which means they're worth a huge amount to people in terms of what you do with them. I'm watching that one because it's like a warning. Not a warning in a bad way, I just mean like a weak signal, we call it in the world of futures and foresight. This is something that we could begin to see happening in Poland, in Finland, in Italy, in Thailand. All of these countries have declining populations, again, demographics. And so you start getting cities with what they call in Japan spongification. So these sponges, essentially like holes appearing in them, which is great because a hole is like possibility. It's an incomplete city at that point. It means you could do something in these things. And sometimes they're great buildings. Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they're great buildings. And whipping them out of the property market makes them actually more attractive, not less. All of these are kind of urban futures in that they are either literally in reasonable sized towns or even places like Tokyo, which have these kind of pockets and holes emerging at huge scale. Or they're connected to cities as well. Sometimes the people going back are also living in Tokyo or moving backwards and forwards between these two types of existence. I think that's really incredibly interesting and full of kind of possibility, actually, as opposed to the idea that you just live in the middle of Tokyo, live in the middle of Warsaw or London or whatever.
Can a future in your imagination exist when we are not living in centralized places? So with COVID, we also learned that we can work from home. There are energy generating ideas where we can generate our own energy. There are solutions where we can clarify water, whatever that may be. So we can live off the grid without being in the city, being in a center. Can you see some signals for that in the future, or this is completely divorced from reality for now?
I think you can do those things in cities, of course. So I think the interesting possibility is more this kind of distributed approach to infrastructures can also work in cities. The idea of 15-minute cities is, of course, an example of that. Or I did a project in Sweden, which is even 1-minute cities, right? And so that's the kind of scale of a street or a block. And you can have energy at the scale of a block or a street now. You can have a mobility network at the scale of a neighborhood, for sure. So those things are full of possibility, actually, because it means that you can then think about we need large, big, centralized systems for large, big, centralized questions. So you need a subway system once a city gets over 500,000 people, and that isn't something citizens can build by themselves, right? That's takes billions of dollars and 20 years, and there's lots of liability and risk and all of those things. So it works for that scale of stuff, but you don't have a subway system at the scale of a street. So that's absurd. That's where you're walking or rolling or whatever. And that's something that citizens can do by themselves. I'm much more interested in this kind of question of these multiple systems at different scales, moving from, if you like, 1 minute to 15 minutes, to 30 minutes, to 60 minutes, 120 minutes and beyond. And recognizing you have different systems there. They all overlap or they're all nested inside each other. The more systems, the more microgrids you have at the scale of buildings, the less you need a regional grid. But you still need a regional grid for something, as in backup or peak load or resilience, those kinds of things. It doesn't need as much of that because you also have these distributed systems at the scales of blocks and streets. Blocks and streets, people can do themselves, more or less, often. But you want them to be maybe part of a municipal grid or be able to move energy backwards and forwards between them. So then what I'm trying to get at there is that you don't then overlay the idea that everything is a certain scale and everything needs to be this big municipal system run by the mayor and his or her team. You can also make space for these kind of pockets of distributed community scale, cooperative or co-owned structures, and then this middle ground of that kind of 15-minute city scale where municipal and cooperative systems then interact with each other. That seems the most interesting thing to me because it's then this much more diverse spectrum of infrastructures up and down the scale. Now, everything I've just described there is urban. Like that could be in the middle of Paris or it could be in the middle of Lagos. You could have these large municipal systems, these very local systems at the scales of buildings again. You can see it easily makes sense if you think about energy in that way, as I just explained, but you can also think about mobility and food and aspects of culture, education, all of those things. Football, like you can have a game of street football in your street. You can organize it yourself. You don't need to check with the mayor about that kind of thing. The cost is zero. The liability is not much, maybe a sprained ankle or a broken window. But at the large scale of a city of 500,000 people, you need a national stadium for that kind of thing. Well, you need a big stadium anyway, right? And that's $100 million and it costs a lot of time to make and it's got a big team of experts on it and so on. In the middle bit, you have school playing fields or you have a local sports center, things like that, which could be municipal, but it also has community groups in it. Up and down those scales, I think, is probably the way to think about infrastructure. All of that is, like I said, urban. I think maybe where you were driving with your question is obviously some of those infrastructures can also work in a non-urban condition, like a rural or regional condition. You can go off-grid, of course, and the classic use of off-grid is much more in the countryside than in the city usually. I guess I'm describing the possibility that you can also now go off-grid in a city, although it's not really off-grid if it's in a city because it's connected to everything else around it. I don't think there's genuinely possible to think of off-grid in a city. Just it's like saying I'm a private individual and I'm not part of the city. You can't do that. There's a really nice way of thinking about that. Su Fujimoto, the architect, he just described the inside of your house is just the most private part of the city. If you're in your bathroom, then of course that's private, but you're still in the city. Like it's still in the city, isn't it? So it's still in some sense a public condition linked to other things around it, whether that's through plumbing or through culture. And then if you step out into the street, then you can be a private individual, but you're in the street. So you're still in the city. It's just you're more public or less public. So I'd say the city, you're always public and connected. This is why it's complex to talk about privacy in the context of a city, right? This sort of makes sense, doesn't. Now, in the countryside, you can be thought of, let's just say, the archetypal idea of the hermit who lives by themselves in a cave, right? Totally possible to imagine that. Not really in a city. So you can do that technically, and you can generate your own energy. You could capture your stormwater and rainwater. You could do all of those things. That's distinctly non-urban. I don't think that's particularly interesting or viable is because it turns out humans are really social animals. When you look at it, we tend to gravitate towards other humans. We kind of work in packs and herds. We're not like a lonely animal in that sense. So I think the human deep down, all the evidence suggests, is highly social. So we tend towards cities rather than living in the cave by ourselves. And so I'm more interested in, okay, how do we live together at scale? And that scale can be 500 people or 500,000 people either way, or 5 million people. But those are the more interesting questions, it seems to me. And this way of thinking of these different scales and dynamics of systems enables us to move up and down those scales. But you're always doing it with other people. And that's what humanity is about, really.
Is there an ideal scale?
Nah. Because what would that mean? An ideal scale for what? Because it's an ideal scale for football, or an ideal scale for religion, or an ideal scale for shopping, or like all of these things are possible at different scales. It's really, again, a cultural question, and ideal is also a complex one. So no, I don't think so. I'm not sure there's an ideal density even. I do think there are, if I'm working on urban strategy, which I do, then I might say, given the current conditions in lots of cities, the kind of cities I work in, and given what we're trying to do let's say in terms of carbon crossed with public health, crossed with cultural diversity, these really complex trade-offs and balancing acts, then I think you could make a case to say that like a nice, useful density would be between 3 and 8-story apartment blocks, oriented well with narrow floor plates and active street fronts and biodiverse spaces. I could make the list like that, right? And then in reality, of course, I'm describing something a bit like Helsinki crossed with chunks of Tokyo, but like in reality, even then you'd want that kind of undulating roofscape. So sometimes it might be 3 stories, sometimes it might be 8. It doesn't really matter if it's 10. Equally, it might drop down to 1 occasionally. But in reality, just if we're looking at a city that we're currently working with, or most of the cities around us, and trying to say, what's this like good balancing act of diversity, density, for reasons of materials and culture and health and all those things, then sure, I'd come up with a set of guidelines around that kind of 3 to 8 scale, because at that scale you can build convivial places and you can shout up to somebody on the balcony at the 5th floor, more or less, in a way that you can't really on the 45th floor. That's basically impossible. The materials to make 3 to 8 stories, totally fine to do that fully in timber, for instance. And you can make a 45-story tower in timber. It's taking a lot of extra energy and it's increasing sort of footprint of it at the ground plane as well. Once you do all of those kind of trade-offs, you do end up, to my mind at least, in that kind of scale for at least the kind of cities that we are often working with now. But that's me working through lots of trade-offs there and then saying in reality, without specifying the density, I want to try to specify the outcomes. As in, can we have people that are healthy and happy, living within planetary boundaries? Like those are outcomes, right? And then how each city chooses to get there, that's up to them and how inventive and creative they are within that kind of constraint. That would enable you to then have this diversity that makes Milan different to Osaka, but they could both be healthy, happy, within planetary boundaries kind of cities.
You mentioned previously that we can't engineer the future. I would love to know how we can help cities become happy and healthy in the future, or people become healthy and happy in the future, if we can't engineer the future.
That would be doing what I'm implying, that we don't want to specify the exact solution here or the particular means. Whereas what engineers are very good at is specifying the particular solution. Once we've clarified the problem in the right way, got the right question, then this is the power of an engineering-led approach that would enable us to optimize very quickly within that kind of problem space. That's incredibly powerful once we've done that. The issue is that we often jump to that too quickly without having thought, what is the real question here? What are the outcomes? The British architect Cedric Price said this in 1966. He said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think that's the thing we need to keep addressing here. He was talking about cars and cities and many other things as well. Our tendency to jump on, hey, the private car looks like a great way to get around cities. That's the answer. Without stepping back and saying, again, what is this city about? How should it move around? What are people doing? How close do they live to where they work or play or whatever they want to do? Those would have been better questions. And then we could have organized technologies and solutions, right? So all I'm saying is we can't engineer the future in that way because we do not know all of the facts. And people in the 60s thought cars were a great idea. They're not a great idea. They're a really bad idea. But they're not dumb people. They just, again, they looked at the answer without really digging into the questions properly and giving them any kind of wiggle room for change. This is the other problem with that kind of technology, of course, is when you build around the car, then you're building things like freeways out of stuff like concrete. It's incredibly hard to then shift that. The sunk cost of that, it makes it a kind of an asset that you then have to keep on believing in and keep on doubling down on, despite things changing, like climate change. And so that's the issue with it. Not only do we over-specify the solution, we then tend to make a solution that's very hard to change. Better way to do that would be to build as little as possible, actually. I think the engineer, Fry Otto, said that. He is an example of a brilliant engineer. It's just to show that I'm not being mean about engineers. But he can be fantastic at this. But he said, And he's the guy that did the Munich Olympic Stadium design in 1972. It's amazing roof structure and many other things. But he said the secret of the future is building as little as possible in a way. And that's a much smarter way to go, because it really asks you to think very carefully about, okay, what are we making? And to what for? And for who? And with who? And then equally, if it's not the right thing, then we can change it. So to build places that are adaptable would be the smartest possible way of organizing, particularly for a highly unpredictable future, which is probably what we're going into, or if we're already in it, actually. So that would be a way of getting to your point whilst dodging the question. So as in, the approach is not to do what an engineer is asked to do, which is to optimize and specify within a problem space and try and find the perfect solution. It's actually to give yourself wiggle room, to give yourself multiple get-out-of-jail-free cards, to have plan Bs in your pocket all the time, which means designing in a certain way. Whilst moving forward, we can still make things happen and respond to challenges, but we need that kind of flex. And that's a different design philosophy, more like adaptive design, basically. And again, to do that, though, you can still be clear about the outcomes, as in you still say, I want healthy, happy children skipping down super green streets on their way to school. There's an outcome one way or another, because it's got biodiversity and health and people and culture in that implied, even in that quick sentence I made up. But then what you were imagining was slightly different to me, for sure, because we're different people. Even in those, whatever I said, 12 words, there's like already as many possibilities as you have listeners on the table. And that enables us to then explore a really rich set of diverse ideas, then all of which would be heading towards that healthy, happy kind of set of outcomes.
First, I would love to understand what are the 3 biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
Just building on that conversation we just had was that we, first of all, don't recognize the situation we're in. The reason I started with those material flows and things was just recognizing that we have been incredibly wasteful and careless, and we've now put ourselves in a really difficult spot. And yet there's still, I would say, not a real recognition of that. If I just think about being here in Australia, it's certainly not a real recognition of that. For instance, sort of housing targets were announced recently. All those housing targets imply, because they don't specify otherwise, a huge increase in carbon emissions in terms of embodied carbon, for instance. And that is consciously or unconsciously, they're separating out housing targets, which is one policy agenda, from the climate targets, which is another policy agenda. But the reality is they're both using the same materials at the end of the day. There's not like a separate set of special materials for housing, which we don't use for everything else. We're just trading off against each other. And because they haven't been rethinking how do we do construction or how do we do retrofit, and do we have circular biomaterials from regenerative sources with the resource construction industry, like none of that stuff's in place, despite the fact we've known about this for 30 odd years or so. That first thing, I think, is that we really need to recognize the situation we've put ourselves in and start really rapidly reversing a set of those current policies and agendas, which means a radically different approach. It doesn't mean like a little incremental approach of just using the same methods, just trying harder. It means different methods. It's the difference between one tool and another tool. And you can't use the tool that created climate change to also fix climate change. It's really hard to do that. That would be the first one, really, which is also number 2 and number 3. That's so overriding that we need to take it so profoundly seriously. Without getting that one in place, it doesn't really must matter what the other ones are, because that fear could be broken down into this recognition of the issue, the cultivation or creation of new approaches for those new perspectives required, really, or new practices. And then thirdly, a kind of theory of change for how we might then bring that into place. And if we get any one of those 3 wrong, then we're in trouble, because without the theory of change, that's often where we are now. It's like we have some potential solutions, but then what do? Just email the Prime Minister, and then he or she just says, okay, great, flick the switch, not going to work. As we can don't even email everybody in the country, because I know, but there's lots of other issues, or I don't know, and I don't agree with like all of this. That will happen too. So theory of change, like how we put this stuff into practice, is really important. Then the second thing with those new sort of practices and perspectives, we need to be quietly building up when we're ready to actually deploy, and that needs to be like now. But again, that's what the theory of change's job is to do. So how do you move these practices into place? all of that is preceded by the first one, which is a recognition of the situation.
Coming from this thinking that this is your biggest fear, are you optimistic about the future?
I don't know, actually, because it's like, yes, no. And if that's not what an optimist does. I think I'm accused of being an optimist, by the way, by my wife mainly, which is probably true. And I think designers to some degree are inveterate optimists because we are trained, if you like, or encouraged, or we encourage ourselves to think that things are possible, as in design is about the art of what's possible, right? If you think about what design is at the end of the day, it's a set of possible trajectories towards some better intended outcomes in some way. And so it has that built into its framing, absolutely. It's quite hard not to be an optimist and a designer in that sense, at least. The reason I'm prevaricating about this a bit is because of Rebecca Solnit, the writer, has this very good take on the difference between optimism and hope. And she says hope is actually more powerful and more important in a sense, because optimists tend to believe that things will turn out fine and then they don't do anything about it as a result because they assume it's going to be okay. Whereas to be hopeful, you have to actually build hope and make it happen. Like hope is like a kind of a thing you have to make. You have to build it up in people through work or through engagement or collaboration or something like that. So I prefer her thought on this, that hope is more important versus optimism in that sense, because again, optimism otherwise could be a little bit lazy or careless. It's just an assumption.
So, are you hopeful about the future?
Yeah, I really dodged the question, didn't I? That's it depends thing, isn't it? Because again, the optimist in me says I am, but then the thing I just said means that it doesn't really matter what I think will be the outcome. It's more about, can we generate hope? And can we generate sufficient hope to enable the outcome to happen, to build the outcome together? So I think that's totally possible. I really do. I think most of the technical solutions, for instance, are in front of us. There's very little that we need to figure out technically, I think. It just depends on the way we approach that. So if we approach that with hope and build hope together, then totally doable. If we don't do that in the right way, if we don't take our kind of frameworks apart a bit, for instance, if we assume that we can carry on consuming at the rate we're doing and then just chuck a green engine instead of a dark smoky engine, that's not going to work at all because we just don't have the materials for it. It's just absurd. Like I was looking at the data on the UK's electric vehicle strategy the other day, which is basically all cars and trucks electric by 2050 and stop selling new ones from 2035 onwards unless they're electric. And there's a very good paper that suggests that would use twice the amount of cobalt in the world and almost all of its neodymium and a good chunk of the lithium just to do the UK. This is what I mean about these kind of fake boundaries. That's just the UK strategy. That means there's nothing left for Germany or France or Japan or Nigeria or US. It's absurd. Of course, there has to be also be materials left for them too. So the only thing you can do then is just produce fewer cars in the first place, which means you have to rethink the way we tackle that challenge. Again, completely doable, because actually cars are a really dumb idea anyway. And it's much better to have a city that would have a range of mobility types, again, based on those 1 minute, 15 minute, 30 minute, blah, blah, blah. We'd have subways and trams and buses and really strong public transport down via e-bikes and even little autonomous shuttles, I don't mind. And then bikes, wheelchairs and skateboards and scooters, fine. And then in there somewhere, there's a room for some private cars for sure, because they still have a place within that mix of mobility. But if you took that approach, then absolutely, because then we can start looking at the resources we have to hand. We can stretch it across that kind of mobility spectrum. We know that'll work. Like the numbers are easy to make that work at the scale of even a city like London or Tokyo, actually. What you can't do is take the kind of 1980s American city or Australian city idea and also make that work too. There isn't enough material for that one. So if we rethink our perspectives and we start thinking about our systems in that far more joined up way, rather than individualistic consumers just carrying on as they are, then absolutely all those technical solutions, if we put demand and supply on the table, are possible. But that isn't currently what we're doing. Governments tend to take a very supply side approach, as we need to supply new energy into the mix. We need to supply new housing. We need to supply new vehicles. They're not really looking at reducing the demand for those things, because that sounds like a step backwards to them, and it isn't at all. It's just in a different direction. and it could be fully harmonious and incredibly enriching and rewarding people. So it's not a step backwards, it's forwards, but that takes a different perspective.
I would assume that this is an opportunity for you. So what are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
Professionally, so like a lot of my work is in this, as a designer, is in this kind of connecting the big picture of policy and strategy down to the detail of stuff on the ground. So that's the way that I, as you can probably tell by the way I've answered your questions, that's the way that I tend to see my work as a designer, like how we create the possibility of that technology of the microgrid or the e-bike network. How would that then map onto something the scale of a city or a country? Good question, right? That's that kind of zooming up and down the scale between that, the micro of the particular situation, understanding individual behaviors and communities and cultural diversity and super local environments, and then spreading and scaling that back out up through the system to make sure that it also works at that global scale. That to me is the practice that I've tried to pursue and through various jobs and opportunities. But then where I am now is currently running a design school where we're then trying to bake that thinking into the way that we approach training the next generation of designers, practitioners, etc. That's super hard, I would say. I run the graduate school here, and a lot of the master's programs are based around professional disciplines of architecture and urban design or urban planning and things like that, property and construction and so on. All of those things are very codified, and basically this is what you need to be if you're going to call yourself a professional architect or a professional property person. I would say almost all of those definitions are very backward looking, describe the world we've been in rather than the world we're going to. That's the work for me now, is taking that kind of practice I described a moment ago and then rethinking what kind of design school could produce those kinds of outcomes one way or another. What kind of designers might we need for the 21st century? I'm using design in the broadest sense here, including architects and construction folk and property folk, people involved in and around design in that sense. So that's maybe the second opportunity there outside of my first one, is that kind of practice I described, which is this kind of strategic design approach. The second one then is creating educational environments to produce those kinds of outcomes. I guess the third one is then putting that into practice. I'm not very academic in that sense, in that I've only really been an academic for a couple of years. I've hung around it a lot, so I like smell of academia now. But I don't get motivated by the idea of being on the campus separated from the world around it. For me, the value of all of that work is to put it into practice, and the best way of learning is through doing. And so that would be finding partners, communities, places that really are wanting to explore this kind of work or need to explore this kind of work because of a challenge they have or whatever. That would enable us to really start testing it. So the first bit, again, was this is like the theory of this kind of design work, if you like. The second bit is creating a school which can start producing what we think maybe those kinds of skills and perspectives. And the third one is more then, can we do that in collaboration, in practice with places, so that we also have a meaningful impact on and with the world, as opposed to just doing it in the academy. So those are a few things that I'm coming back to at the moment.
So the opportunities were the connection between big picture and the details, the education, and then the connection between practice and academia. Yeah. If these are the opportunities, what are the 3 biggest strengths regarding the future of cities for you?
You like your questions organized in 3s, don't you? So the opportunities that the cities provide for those 3 different things that I said are this combination of maybe the need for that, the desire or demand for that, and then the possibility of playing them out in cities. So the first one is really cities need this kind of, I don't mean this in an arrogant sense, I just think that cities would benefit from thinking about systems, but in a way that recognizes cultures. And what I mean by that is that first one. So recognizing the specificity of a place, this kind of super local possibility that one neighborhood is different to another, but then that how you thread those systems together, both in those places and that scale that makes a city. So again, coming back to my metaphor of these kind of tangled knots of things, if people were able to start imagining and working in that way, I think it would be immensely beneficial, because it would mean you'd have to do it in participation with those places. So you'd have to figure out a highly participative approach that would enable those local cultures to step forward and recognize, again, a city is made up of multiple different communities, non-human as well as human, by the way, but all these different scales. So that's something that cities would benefit from, I think, because then we start getting into this, okay, how are we going to make these systems work at that scale? What is energy? It's not just one big coal-fired power station anymore. Multiple systems threaded together, nested inside each other, interacting with each other in different complex ways, different patterns, different rhythms of those things. Same with culture, same with mobility, all of those things. That's a really powerful way of recognizing the way that cities are both incredibly local and small, and at the same time, these vast things. Tokyo is probably the best example because it's 39 million people, the biggest urban area in the world, really. The joy of Tokyo is that it feels small, weirdly. Like when you go to a neighborhood, if you step out of the subway station, within a couple of minutes walk, you're into this really quiet, almost low density. It's not really low density, but it's low rise, high density, or low rise, mid density. Super intimate, quiet, local moments. And also every neighborhood feels different to every other neighborhood. So you get that super specificity. And at the same time, it's 38 million people. Like, how does that work? Also, Hamburg is also Sheffield is. It's just that we don't often find a way of working in that way. So I think that would be the thing that cities would benefit from, at least. And then they also make it the best kind of proving ground or testing ground for these kinds of approaches, because you get true complexity at that level. You also get complexity in any natural ecosystem. So you could say a village is also a complex system if you wrapped it into its natural environment properly. It is a complex system. But Tokyo is that kind of multiplied by 39 million. So it's kind of a challenge to work with cities, which is what makes them interesting. You see, they are not easy in that way.
I would love to know whether you think about cities in space.
You mean in space? I don't think it's a good idea at all. I can think about it. If someone forced me to imagine such a thing and made a very good case for doing it, then sure, I can come up with something. But I think it's a total waste of time, to be really clear, and also a distraction. 2 reasons for doing it would be we've really wrecked the planet, so we need to get off it. Or we've really wrecked the planet and we run out of resources, and so we need to get resources from other planets to help our planet. Both of those are a terrible, pessimistic, unhopeful outcome for humanity. As I said before, I genuinely believe, hopeful in the sense that I think we can do it. We can live within planetary boundaries, so we don't have to have this extractive approach to resources that would necessitate us to colonize Mars or whatever for lithium or whatever we think might be out there. So that then makes you wonder, why are we doing it then? There's very little reason to do that, other than I'm all in favor of science within ethical boundaries, exploring things that are worth exploring on their own terms. So I have no problem with the Apollo program or things like that for what it's worth. Actually, leaving aside the Cold War framing, which is problematic, but the idea of exploring space and then that will generate some technological and scientific discovery, and including spillovers, unpredictable things, fantastic. In the same way that I would also like us to be exploring cellular structures in the other direction, or the bottom of the ocean, like totally fine. So I'm all up for that. It's a distraction largely from the really meaningful work we need to do to learn how to live within our own planetary boundaries. And if anything, it's really a continuation of this kind of colonial extraction idea. The same mentality that made the British, first of all, take America and then Australia and most of the rest of the world, which was that very ethically problematic is the lightest way I can say it. It's hugely problematic to think like that as a species. It's got us into all kinds of trouble. So why would we continue to do that? Folk like Bezos and Musk, I think, are the most careless, lazy thinkers about this stuff, because they actually, if they used their resources thoughtfully, they could genuinely help us live within planetary boundaries on Earth. But at the moment, they are just completely replicating that 18th century colonial mindset, which is, worse than lazy, for sure. That's a firm no, isn't it?
What does smart city mean to you?
So I've got a long history with this, going back almost 20 years. You know what it means in reality, and not much of that is good. What I'd like to think it could mean is just a terrible term, to be clear. It's just not the best way of thinking about cities and smart. If you say something smart, actually in English, it's often derogatory as much as it doesn't really mean intelligent, often can mean more clever, which is smart for its own sake, or rather than resourceful, for instance, or creative. They're a bit more specific even. Anyway, I think what it could mean, I asked the artist and musician Brian Eno to write some design principles for a project I was working on in Sweden to do with streets. He said a truly smart city would be one in which the city was able to harness the collective creative resources and intelligence of its inhabitants. So I think that's an interesting definition of it, right? And even if you extend inhabitants, by the way, to include non-human inhabitants. So imagine natural intelligence is there as well. We might even speculate about artificial intelligence as being meaningfully part of the city, as they are right now, obviously. But like in future, we might have human intelligences, other types of non-human but natural intelligences and artificial intelligences all swimming around in the city. Imagine if we could harness that true capability and creativity of all of those things, figuring out a way of them working off against each other in a non-extractive and collaborative way. That would be a smart city. Every single person, everything that they're able of thinking and creating, they're able to contribute to the city, as well as all of those ecosystem or natural intelligences, as well as AI and its own particular non-human intelligences as well. The blend of those things, that would be smart in that sense. That isn't what it is at the minute. Obviously, a smart city at the moment has been a largely technology corporation-led procurement strategy. So it's the dumbest and most boring thing ever. It started in the early days of basically how can these large corporations like, let's say, Cisco and Microsoft and others, could have been any number, all of the large consulting firms effectively begin to take public ownership into private ownership through procurement strategies for most basic IT things, right? It was even missing the interesting stuff that was happening around the edges there, like when Uber and Airbnb and WeWork started to emerge. And you really had physical bits of city being moved around by technology. Like Uber was not seen as a smart city play. It's hugely problematic in other ways, Uber, of course, but as a technology intervention in cities, then genuinely powerful, transformed the way that mobility worked. Again, often very negatively, but still, that wasn't seen as a smart city come, but it absolutely was. Airbnb, likewise. Actually, if you think about it, Uber is basically taxis and Airbnb is basically hotel rooms. Those things have been around for hundreds of years in different forms. So they're distinctly urban. Both of them enabled a transformation of those things through the internet, one way or another. But it's quite telling that wasn't talked about as smart city and it's something else there. Whereas smart city was this stuff over here, urban IoT, and then dashboards and stuff. Just because that's the thing that it was easy to sell. But to get back to the starting point of the conversation, if we think a city is about culture and community and conviviality and perhaps commerce or nature, all of those things coming together, then technology is part of that play. You really have culture, nature, and technology as these three big things. Nature is what we are, technology are the tools that we make, and culture is what we do with them. That's what a city is really about. So technology is there, but clearly that wasn't what the smart city movement was about. But that's what I think it could be about.
Dan, you have been very generous with your time. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I work on city projects. I work with governments and city governments or big companies or small companies or communities and others are in cities on projects. So that's a big part of my job is to be a doer and practitioner in those things. But I guess something I might also do is reflect on that a little bit. Not that other people reflect on it too, but then I'm boring enough to write it down. I then speak about this a lot and I write things a lot because I'm trying to get ideas out there as well beyond the project that I'm working on. So I might learn a lot from the projects and the people I'm collaborating with. But I will try and step back and frame that as a, here's what I learned, or here's a half-formed thought, here's a possible idea coming out of that. I guess I also, over time, have become that kind of person too, that describes possibilities around things through various means, as well as working on the ground on those projects as well. So maybe that's another way of thinking of that, consuming backwards and forwards between the instance of the thing, the particular project, and then stepping back and trying to see what the big picture might be or what the learning is, and then sharing that for discussion and critique and collaboration. My role is then twofold, as a practitioner, but then also, I don't know what the word is for that other thing, but it's somebody that, I guess this is where I use the word urbanist, actually, because that is someone whose job, in a way, is cities. So the job is then reflecting on cities and their particular patterns and materials and dynamics and communicating that and thinking about that.
And I would like to ask you to please keep up this good work, because just listening to you, I'm learning a lot about cities.
I'm learning from the way I answer your questions.
Thank you. Also, really appreciate that you are teaching this kind of thinking to the next generation, because we need these systems thinkers in the future. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I'm interested to see what people do with those thoughts. Please critique or push back, constructive way, in a nice way, because I'm interested to see, again, as you can tell from the way I approach the questions, these are not things that I have a prepared script for, because as you can tell, my work is about this kind of open and adaptive and exploratory kind of approach. So the way I'm answering the questions is also like that, right? I'm literally making it up as I go along, even though it's based on years of experience. So in that spirit, I'd like people to take the ideas and run with them, or share them, or build on them, or pick holes in them, either way, but work with them. That's what I'd like to hear about.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It was really interesting to hear from Dan about his specific questions while talking and thinking about the future of cities. Not to mention his description of change and urban evolution. Richard Gill talked about the theory and process of change in episode 274. You can find out more about Dan online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Dan's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website, where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?